Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome to Morningside Village. The air in St. Mary Mead carries the scent of autumn tonight, wood smoke drifting gently through the hedgerows, and the faint rustle of leaves brushing against cottage windows. The lamps have begun to glow along the lane, casting soft halos on the cobblestones where footsteps rarely hurry. Somewhere a kettle hums and a cat curls closer to the fire. Here, in Morningside Village, every story begins quietly like a whisper over tea. I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're settled beneath a blanket, or maybe the fire beside you burns low. And tell me truly, do you like my new voice? I've made it warmer, softer, just for evenings like this. Have you ever noticed how every old cottage seems to hold its breath, just before it tells you what it's been hiding? Tonight, in Welcome to Morningside Village, we'll follow the quiet footsteps, faint lights, and hidden secrets that linger behind the doors and garden gates of this gentle, curious village. Every whispered rumor, every soft creak of a floorboard, and every fleeting shadow may guide us toward stories that have waited patiently, just beneath the surface. Here, with the lamps aglow and tea steaming, let us step together into the rhythm of St. Mary Mead, where calm afternoons and small mysteries mingle, and where even the softest sound can carry a story worth listening to. Morningside Cottage had stood empty for nearly half a year, its windows shuttered, its gate rusted slightly on its hinges. Yet on a misty October night, when the air hung thick and silver over St. Mary Mead, a light appeared in the upper window, faint, flickering like a candle caught between breaths. The postman, trudging home through the lane, stopped and blinked, certain he saw movement behind the curtain. But when he looked again, the light was gone, swallowed by fog and silence. By morning, the village was humming with whispers. The vicar's wife, always the first to notice, said she found the garden gate ajar. A cup of tea sat on the porch table, steam still curling softly in the chill. No footprints, no visitors, no explanation. Just that single sign of life in a place that should have been lifeless. Mrs. Price Ridley said the new tenant must have arrived early. Mrs. Bantry thought it nonsense. Yet as the days passed, no one came or went. Children crossed the road rather than past the cottage. And when the fog rolled in again, villagers claimed they saw it. A glow returning to the upstairs room, faint and steady as a heartbeat. And if you looked close enough, you could see it too. The faint shadow of a woman in the upstairs room, standing perfectly still. Chapter 1. The Return of Miss Marple. The train from London arrived at St. Mary Mead just past midday, its whistle fading into the soft hum of the countryside. Miss Marple stepped down carefully, her small gloved hands holding onto the railing, and drew in the sweet familiar air of home, apple orchards, wood smoke, and the faint tang of autumn dampness. She had spent a week in the city visiting her nephew Raymond, a charming man, though entirely too modern for her liking. London had its excitements, of course, but she preferred the quieter puzzles of village life, those unsolved riddles that hid behind every polite smile and pot of jam. As she made her way through the village lane, she noticed a curious energy in the air. Mrs. Weatherby waved distractedly from her gate but seemed far too preoccupied to chat. Two men outside the grocer's spoke in low tones, glancing now and then toward Morningside Road. By the time Miss Marple reached the corner shop, she had gathered enough snippets to know that something, or someone, had stirred the calm of St. Mary Mead while she was away. Inside Mrs. Bantry's warm sitting room, the teapot steamed companionably beside a plate of currant scones. Mrs. Price Ridley was already there, seated upright and alert like a cat waiting for cream. "My dear Miss Marple," she began at once, "you've returned just in time for the most extraordinary tale. You've heard, of course, about the light in the window?" Miss Marple smiled faintly and reached for her knitting. "Only a whisper or two," she said, clicking her needles together. "Do tell me properly." And they did, each woman eager to outdo the other in detail. Mrs. Price Ridley swore the postman saw a figure in white. Mrs. Bantry insisted it was blue, and that it moved as if floating. Mrs. Price Ridley countered that no such nonsense could be true, though her voice trembled slightly as she said it. Between the two, the story grew like ivy, tangled and alive, half-truths winding through speculation. Miss Marple listened, nodding now and then, her needles flashing steadily in the light. She knew the value of silence, People filled it with far more than they intended. Through the rhythm of gossip she heard patterns. What was said, what was left unsaid, and the subtle spaces between. "I suppose," she murmured, "it might be someone taking shelter. Poor thing if they've nowhere else to go." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice to a whisper. "The cottage has been empty since the spring. Who'd come back there in October and without telling a soul?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the garden beyond was turning gold and brown. "Oh," she said softly, "there are always those who prefer to arrive unseen. Some people slip in like a shadow and mean no harm at all. Others—" She paused, her knitting needles coming to rest. "Well, others prefer not to be noticed until they must." The clock ticked gently on the mantelpiece. Outside, a few leaves brushed against the glass, carried by the wind. The village cat padded along the garden path, tail upright, pausing to peer toward the lane that led to Morningside Cottage. When people gossip, Miss Marple thought, facts hide between the silences, and somewhere among all the talk of lights and shadows, she felt that familiar tingle of curiosity, the quiet certainty that something quite interesting had begun once more in St. Mary Mead. The next morning brought a pale, pearly light that softened the rooftops of St. Mary Mead and turned the hedgerows silver with dew. Miss Marple set out for her customary walk, shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders, her small feet making crisp sounds along the gravel path. She took the long way round the church, past the vicarage and down toward Morningside Lane, the very path she noted that most villagers now avoided. It was the sort of morning that smelled of damp earth and mystery. Morningside Cottage came into view behind a tangle of ivy and untrimmed rose bushes. Its stone walls were streaked with moss, its gate hanging slightly askew. The curtains at the front window were drawn, though a faint line of light slipped through the crack where the fabric didn't quite meet. Miss Marple paused by the fence, pretending to inspect a clump of daisies that had somehow survived the frost. As she did, she thought she saw the curtain twitch, just the smallest movement, as if a hand had brushed against it. Yet there was no breeze. The air was perfectly still. At that moment old Mr. Larkin, the village gardener, appeared from the lane with his wheelbarrow full of tools. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, tipping his cap. "You've been to have a look, then? Everyone's talking about that place." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "It's difficult not to, Mr. Larkin. Curiosity seems to grow quicker than ivy in this village." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I saw it myself just last night. Candlelight, plain as you please. One in the window and another further back. Must have been near midnight. I keep late hours, you know, what with them hedges to trim before frost takes them." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, eyes narrowing just slightly. "And did you see anyone moving inside?" Mr. Larkin shook his head. "No, ma'am. Only the light. But the odd thing is, this morning there were footprints on the step. Small ones, neat as anything. Not a man's, not a child's neither." When he had gone on his way, Miss Marple bent discreetly near the gate. There they were, muddy marks against the stone threshold, faint but distinct. She traced their size with her eyes. Too narrow for a man's shoe, but with a longer stride than she'd expect from a young girl. Someone had stood there for some time, perhaps hesitating before entering. She straightened, feeling the soft wind stir at last, rustling through the ivy. The cottage remained silent. Behind the closed curtains, the air seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple, with her long years of listening and noticing, could almost sense the presence within, like hearing the echo of a thought that hadn't quite faded. As she turned back toward the village, she caught sight of a raven perched on the chimney, its feathers glossy black against the white sky. It gave one harsh call, then flew off toward the churchyard. Miss Marple watched it disappear, her expression thoughtful but calm. "It's strange," she thought, "how fear and curiosity often share the same heartbeat." The gravel crunched softly under her shoes as she walked away, the sound blending with the distant church bell that marked 11. Somewhere behind her, inside Morningside Cottage, a curtain shifted again, slowly this time, as though whoever stood there was now watching her go. Chapter 2. A Stranger in the Village. The sun was just beginning its slow descent behind the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, painting the village in gentle shades of gold and rose. Miss Marple wandered down the main lane, her eyes catching familiar details. The neat stacks of firewood outside the bakery, the small copper bell that jingled each time the postman pushed open the shop door, the soft chatter of children trailing home after school. She paused briefly at Mr. Fletcher's grocer, drawn by the hum of quiet activity and the scent of fresh bread wafting from next door. Inside, the shop was warm and welcoming, lined with shelves of preserves, tea, sugar, and an assortment of tins and packets that promised comfort. The grocer's boy, a lad of 12 with a shy grin, was rearranging a row of jam jars when he glanced up and froze momentarily. "Miss Marple," he began, fidgeting with the labels. "There was a woman here earlier. She bought tea and sugar, but she wasn't from around here. Not that I've ever seen, anyway." Miss Marple's knitting, tucked under her arm, brushed lightly against her coat as she leaned forward, intrigued. "A woman, you say? Describe her to me, please," the boy swallowed. "Pale, ma'am, wearing a green coat, quite elegant." She spoke. "Oh, proper. Like she had lessons, not the way we talk here." She asked about the best tea for a quiet afternoon, and she smiled, polite, but I don't know, her eyes, they were something else. I didn't notice when she came in, not at first, but I can't stop thinking about her eyes. Sharp, as if she could see everything in the room at once. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. The street outside was calm, ordinary, with a cat stretching lazily on the steps of the tailor's. "No one noticed when she came," she murmured. But everyone remembered her eyes. That small observation, she knew, often carried more weight than the loudest gossip. "Did she say where she was staying?" she asked. The boy shook his head. "No, ma'am. She paid with coins that didn't feel local. Foreign, I think. And she didn't linger. Just a polite nod, a quiet thank you, and out she went." Miss Marple's thoughts began to align with the rhythm of the village around her. The quiet streets, the soft creak of doors, the rustle of leaves outside. Someone had arrived in St. Mary Mead who was careful to appear ordinary, yet ordinary would not hide her entirely. There was a weight behind her composure, a story pressed behind the elegant green coat and those eyes that seemed to remember everything. As she left the shop, Miss Marple kept her attention quietly alert. The lane stretched before her, familiar yet suddenly full of possibilities. Somewhere nearby, the woman in green walked the village paths, and Miss Marple could not shake the sense that this stranger would be more than a fleeting curiosity. For a moment, the soft wind carried a faint scent of lilac, and Miss Marple's mind traced the lines of her own small observations. Every detail mattered: the precise tilt of a hat, the careful step along a doorstep, the refined accent that hinted at distant places. In a village like St. Mary Mead, no arrival went entirely unnoticed, and no secret stayed hidden for long. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, when Miss Marple made her way toward the post office. The village was unusually quiet, as though everyone had paused to catch their breath after the recent stirrings at Morningside Cottage. She greeted the postmaster with a polite nod, exchanging a few words about the weather and the slow arrival of autumn mail. It was then that a small, unremarkable envelope caught her eye, lying atop the counter with no indication of sender or recipient beyond the words. Neatly written in black ink, "The resident of Morningside Cottage." The postmaster looked puzzled as he handed it over. "Arrived this morning," he said, shrugging. "No stamp aside from the usual, no name on the sender line. Odd, isn't it?" Miss Marple turned the envelope gently in her hands. The paper was slightly thick, textured as if chosen with care, and the handwriting was precise, elegant, the sort one might associate with a careful governess or a lady accustomed to formal letters. Inside she found a single pressed violet, perfectly preserved between two sheets of tissue paper. No note, no message, no hint of explanation, only the delicate flower, a whisper of thought or perhaps a warning. She slipped it into her coat pocket, her mind quietly cataloging the detail. The absence of words struck her as more significant than any sentence might have been. Who had sent it? Why only a flower? And why now, after the recent lights and shadows at the cottage? In St. Mary Mead, such gestures were rarely accidental. Miss Marple observed the violet closely, noting the tiny crease along one petal, the faint fragrance still clinging to it. It suggested someone who had handled it with care, someone who had paused to press it between pages with a steady hand. Whoever it was, they wished to communicate something without saying a single word. A silent message sent through the language of flowers, which could speak of memory, longing, or caution. As she left the post office, the envelope hidden safely against her chest, she thought about the nature of silence. Often it carried more weight than confession. It allowed the recipient to fill in the blanks, to reflect on intentions and secrets alike. A letter without words could rattle a mind more thoroughly than a scream, and Miss Marple had learned over many years that such quiet intrusions demanded attention. Passing the corner of the lane where the ivy hung thick over Morningside Cottage, she glanced up at the familiar windows. The cottage seemed still, almost ordinary, yet the pressed violet now felt like a small key to a door she hadn't yet realized existed. Sometimes silence in a letter speaks louder than confession, she mused, and Miss Marple's curiosity stirred like a candle flame flickering to life. The village continued its gentle rhythm around her, children laughing in the distance, a dog trotting down the lane, but in that calm, Miss Marple felt the first true ripple of intrigue that would guide her through the coming days. One quiet observation at a time. Chapter 3. The fog descends. The evening had grown heavy and damp, and by the time Miss Marple returned from her afternoon errands, the village of St. Mary Mead was wrapped in a thick, rolling fog. Street lamps glowed dimly through the haze, their light diffused like lanterns in a dream. Every corner seemed softened, every sound muted, yet there was a presence in the stillness that made the familiar lane feel strange and new. Footsteps echoed faintly on the cobblestones, uncertain and fleeting, vanishing before one could identify their source. From her window at the vicarage, Mrs. Price Ridley noticed a shadow shifting along the garden path of Morningside Cottage. She clutched her shawl around her shoulders and listened. A dog barked somewhere far down the lane, sharp and sudden, then fell silent as if it too had sensed the fog's peculiar weight. The usual comfort of home was tinged now with that delicate tension, the kind that makes even the bravest lean closer to the hearth and listen harder. Through the mist, a sound floated faintly, almost imperceptible, a woman humming low and careful, near the cottage. Mrs. Price Ridley strained to hear, wondering if her imagination had turned the whisper of fog into melody. The tune was simple, haunting, carried across the empty street, fading and returning with the uneven drift of the evening air. Each note seemed to fold over the silence, settling like a feather in the heart of the village. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken her usual turn along the lane, her steps quiet against the stones. The fog clung to her coat and hair, curling around her like a soft shawl of mystery. She paused at the edge of the garden, sensing the cottage more than seeing it. There was a subtle movement behind the curtains, and the faintest glimmer of light shifted inside. Someone or something was present, yet remained careful to be unseen. In every fog, she thought, someone is listening. The quiet was layered with intention. Each sound, each pause seemed measured as though the very night itself held its breath, waiting for discovery. Even the street lamp's halo bent and flickered, offering glimpses and concealing truths at once. The village beyond the mist continued its rhythm in muted whispers. Somewhere a shutter rattled. Somewhere else the soft scrape of a gate told of footsteps that had paused and moved on. The humming stopped and the lane seemed to inhale in expectation, carrying its tension over hedges, gardens, and cobblestones alike. Miss Marple adjusted her scarf and continued her walk, the fog thick around her ankles. She noted every detail, the slight indentation of a shoe, the lingering scent of a pipe, the cold kiss of moisture on her cheeks. Each tiny observation was a thread in the growing tapestry of the evening's mystery, waiting to be pulled and revealed. Through the haze the cottage stood in quiet anticipation, and the night whispered its secrets to those patient enough to notice. Footsteps, murmurs, shadows, all converged in the fog, each carrying a story only a careful observer could discern. And Miss Marple, as always, was listening. The fog had grown thicker by the time Miss Marple returned to her own quiet cottage, the lamplight outside casting long, diffuse shadows across the lane. She had just settled near the fire with her knitting when a soft, deliberate knock sounded at the door. It was unusual at this hour for visitors to call, especially those who were not known to the household. Rising, she opened the door to find Inspector Cray, a man whose presence was always calm yet deliberate, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to observing rather than being observed. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Do come in. What brings you out on such a foggy night?" Cray removed his coat and hung it carefully on the hall stand. "It concerns Morningside Cottage," he began. "I imagine you've heard some talk already, but there has been a report of a missing woman, Clara Denham, last seen traveling toward St. Mary Mead a few days ago. No one knows precisely why she came, and no one has seen her since." Miss Marple's fingers, poised over her knitting, stilled for a brief moment. The firelight caught a glint in her eyes, subtle but unmistakable, a spark of curiosity mixed with the keen edge of understanding. "A missing woman, you say?" she murmured. "I suppose the village will be most concerned." Inspector Cray nodded, lowering his voice. "Naturally. I've been making inquiries quietly. I do not wish to alarm the village unnecessarily, but the circumstances are unusual. Morningside Cottage was long thought empty. If Mrs. Denham has arrived here without notice, it would explain certain sightings, the lights, the moving curtains, and the occasional shadows. But it leaves us with more questions than answers." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her mind already piecing together patterns. Every disappearance, she thought, begins with someone pretending not to notice. She offered him tea, which he declined politely, though he accepted a seat by the fire. The warmth and domesticity contrasted sharply with the chill of the fog outside, but neither let it obscure the careful, precise exchange of information. Cray produced a notebook and drew a small sketch of the cottage, noting the points of entry observed by neighbors, the footprints, the lights. He asked questions quietly, without urgency, allowing Miss Marple's subtle observations to fill in the gaps he could not see. "The villagers have been whispering," he said, "but it is difficult to discern fact from speculation. Every story seems half true, yet none complete." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting resting gently on her lap. "And that, Inspector, is precisely where understanding begins, between the stories, in the silences, and in the attention given to what people choose not to mention." The inspector glanced at her thoughtfully, recognizing in her an uncanny ability to see the faintest traces of human behavior. "I thought it prudent to come and speak with you," he admitted. "Your perspective on these things, subtle, patient, thorough, is often more revealing than any witness testimony." The fire crackled softly, the fog pressed thick against the windows, and the quiet of the evening seemed to hold its breath. In that stillness, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, collecting threads of movement, observation, and rumor, weaving them into a pattern that no one else had yet begun to see. Somewhere in the hidden corners of Morningside Cottage, the missing woman had left traces that only patient eyes would find. Chapter 4. Footprints and Teacups. The next morning, Miss Marple found herself once again walking past Morningside Cottage, curiosity tugging at her as surely as the path beneath her feet. The fog had lifted, leaving the air crisp and clear, yet the cottage seemed to hold a quiet tension as though it had been waiting for someone to notice. The front gate hung slightly ajar, and the garden, though tended with care, carried small hints of neglect. Fallen leaves gathered in corners. A stray petal pressed against the stone path. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the doorway, when her gaze fell upon the hearth inside. A teacup lay shattered across the rug, its pieces scattered as if flung in haste. Miss Marple paused, crouching slightly to examine it. The handle had been glued once before. A faint line of repair now split clean through, as though whatever force had struck it was deliberate but panicked. The arrangement of shards suggested a sudden disturbance, a startled movement, rather than careless handling. "It's the small things," she thought. "Always the small things that tell the truth." Her eyes moved to the mantelpiece, noting the neat stack of letters and a small silver tray, with a single sugar cube resting atop it. Everything else appeared orderly, almost serene, yet the broken teacup spoke louder than any tidy arrangement. Miss Marple's mind traced possibilities. The cup dropped by an intruder caught off guard, a resident startled by some sudden noise, or even a visitor unaccustomed to careful domesticity. Each scenario carried its own subtle indicators, and she catalogued them quietly. A soft creak from the upstairs floor made her glance upward. Curtains swayed gently, though the air remained still as if a shadow moved behind the fabric, observing her as intently as she observed the room. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the edge of the broken cup carefully, noting the angles of fracture, the slight chip in the glaze. Whoever had been here, she realized, had left a trace of emotion in the domestic space. Fear, perhaps, or sudden surprise. Beyond the hearth, the afternoon sun began to fall through the windows, casting long golden lines across the wooden floor. The scattered teacup fragments caught the light in tiny, sharp glints, reminding her of how easily a moment's unease could leave a permanent mark. Miss Marple rose to her feet, smoothing the folds of her skirt, her eyes lingering one last time on the hearth. Even in a place so quiet and ostensibly ordinary, subtle hints of human emotion and movement could be found by those willing to look. And in St. Mary Mead, she knew that no disturbance, however small, went unnoticed. The broken teacup was a message in miniature, a silent witness to an unseen event, speaking volumes to anyone who cared to read it. Miss Marple straightened, her mind already tracing connections, cataloging inconsistencies, and forming a pattern that only patience could reveal. It was remarkable, she mused, how the quietest rooms often told the loudest stories. Miss Marple made her way along the winding lane toward the vicarage, her footsteps soft against the dew-kissed grass. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fading roses, and the village seemed to hum with the quiet rhythm of early evening. She rang the small brass bell at the vicarage gate, its chime delicate, yet it echoed faintly across the hedges. A moment later, Mrs. Price Ridley's familiar friend, the vicar's wife, appeared, her expression brightening with welcome. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, smoothing her apron as she led the way inside. "How lovely to see you. Come in before the chill sets in." The sitting room was warm and comforting, with a fire crackling softly in the hearth. Miss Marple settled into a chair near the window, her knitting resting on her lap, and allowed herself a moment to observe. The room was meticulously tidy. Every book, every trinket carefully placed, yet the gentle comfort of home radiated through the space. "I've come," Miss Marple began casually, "to ask you about Morningside Cottage. There's been some unusual activity there recently, and I wondered if you might recall anything about its previous occupants." The vicar's wife nodded, settling back with a sigh. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Clara Denham stayed here many years ago, a sweet, gentle soul. Quiet, polite, yet easily startled by sudden noises or unexpected visitors. One could almost see her retreat into herself when startled." She paused, fingering a delicate lace handkerchief. She was a lady who meant no harm, but, well, there were whispers even then. Nothing scandalous in the grand sense, but a few of the village families remembered odd happenings, quiet misunderstandings, things spoken softly and quickly dismissed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly behind her spectacles. "Old kindnesses often hide forgotten sins," she murmured almost to herself, though the vicar's wife glanced at her thoughtfully. "Yes," the vicar's wife said. She had a way of attracting attention without seeking it. People would talk and she would blush, apologize, and withdraw. It was never dangerous, yet something about her presence, her manners, her tone, made the village pause and wonder. We all remembered her, yet we could never quite place why we were unsettled. Perhaps she carried burdens we could not see. Miss Marple nodded, absorbing the nuance in the quiet confession. The subtle traces of human complexity, of long-forgotten tensions wrapped in civility, were often the key to understanding the present. She sipped her tea, noting the delicate curl of steam, the faint scent of lemon in the air, and the way the vicar's wife's eyes darted briefly toward the window as if recalling private memories. "Did she have any family nearby?" Miss Marple asked gently. "None that I knew of," the vicar's wife replied. She traveled alone, kept to herself mostly, though there were moments brief as shadows when one thought perhaps she was watching, waiting, or perhaps remembering something she wished to forget. The conversation lingered in the warm room like a soft melody. Miss Marple considered the traces of past kindnesses, the way small, well-intended acts could conceal complexities long ignored. The past and present intertwined here, and it was in these quiet, almost imperceptible details that the truth often hid, waiting for a careful observer to uncover it. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's mind was already weaving the threads together, the faint hint of scandal and the gentle presence of Clara Denham forming a pattern that would not remain hidden for long. Outside, the evening air was cooler, yet the village seemed alive with whispered possibilities, each step along the lane carrying her closer to answers waiting quietly in shadowed corners. Chapter 5. The Photograph in the Drawer. Miss Marple spent the early afternoon in the quiet of her own sitting room, the sunlight slanting through the curtains and casting long, golden rectangles across the polished wooden floor. Her knitting rested momentarily in her lap as she allowed her thoughts to wander back to Morningside Cottage. Something about the pattern of lights, the subtle disturbances and the small but telling details of recent days had lodged themselves firmly in her mind. She needed a moment of calm to sort them, and the library, rows of familiar books lined neatly along the shelves, offered the perfect refuge. Drawers along the lower shelves had always intrigued her. One in particular, tucked beneath a row of volumes on local history, seemed slightly less tidy than the others. Its lock was old but not rigid, and with the quiet patience of a seasoned observer, Miss Marple pulled it open. Inside, between papers that had yellowed with age, lay a photograph, its corners curled ever so slightly. She lifted it carefully, brushing a finger along the surface. The image was taken at Morningside Cottage, and even 20 years had not dimmed the essence of the moment it captured. Mrs. Clara Denham stood beside a man in uniform, both smiling faintly, posed against the backdrop of the cottage's garden. There was a lightness to Mrs. Denham's expression that seemed almost at odds with the quiet unease she now inspired in the village. The man beside her carried the formal, upright bearing of someone accustomed to duty and command. It was easy to imagine him stepping away from the photograph's frame into a life of order, discipline and obligations beyond the garden gate. Miss Marple studied the image carefully, noting details others might overlook: the tilt of Mrs. Denham's hat, the faint crease of worry near her eyes, the hand she held lightly against the man's arm as though seeking reassurance. Photographs remember what people prefer to forget, she thought. This one preserved a fragment of life long before whispers, curiosities, or fears had crept into the village lanes. She placed the photograph on the table before her, considering the significance of its presence. Why had it remained hidden in that drawer for so long? What connections between past and present had led someone to tuck it away, out of sight yet within reach? The questions formed quietly like ripples on a still pond, subtle but persistent. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the soft autumn light illuminated the rows of books. She imagined the cottage garden as it had been 2 decades ago. The roses in bloom, the hedges freshly trimmed, the quiet serenity that had now transformed into layers of intrigue. Every detail mattered. The photograph was not merely a record of the past, but a silent witness, hinting at stories that had begun long before the current mystery unfolded. Folding the photograph carefully, she slipped it into her coat pocket. The subtle weight against her hand seemed to anchor her thoughts. Somewhere, connected by time, place, and memory, the pieces of Morningside Cottage's story were waiting to be recognized. And Miss Marple, patient and observant as always, was ready to see them clearly. The afternoon sun slanted low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the lanes and cottages. Miss Marple was quietly reviewing her notes on Morningside Cottage when a soft knock came at her door. Rising, she opened it to reveal a young man in a neatly pressed coat, his hat held tightly in his hands, eyes darting around the familiar surroundings as though weighing every detail. "Good day, ma'am," he said, voice polite but tinged with unease. I am Edward Denham, Mrs. Clara Denham's nephew. I've come to see if you might assist me in locating her. She has not been in touch, and the villagers thought perhaps you could advise." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly behind her spectacles, though her smile remained serene. She gestured him inside and offered a seat. "Do sit, Mr. Denham. I am always happy to help, though I must confess I have yet to meet you. Tell me, how long has it been since you last saw your aunt?" The young man fidgeted slightly, adjusting his hands in his lap as he spoke. His voice carried a rehearsed politeness, but the subtle tremor betrayed a nervousness he did not wish to display. "Several years, ma'am. She has been staying at various places, and I had hoped to find her here. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze calm yet penetrating. She listened carefully as he spoke, noting the way his hands tapped lightly against the armrest, the cautious rise and fall of his tone. There was something deliberate in his measured speech, but a careful observer might detect the hesitation between words, the small, involuntary signals that betrayed uncertainty. "I imagine," she said gently, "that the cottage has changed somewhat over the years. Perhaps you remember the garden path that curves along the rose bushes." He blinked, a faint flush creeping across his cheeks. "Garden path?" he repeated slowly, as if testing the memory. I don't recall any particular path." Miss Marple's lips curved into a subtle smile. Truth never trembles, but lies always do. The young man's avoidance of the detail, the small but telling hesitation, spoke volumes. A nephew unfamiliar with the cottage in such a fundamental way could not genuinely claim intimacy with the place. And yet his manner remained polite, his posture respectful, masking the deeper unease that any lie carries beneath practiced civility. She sipped her tea, watching him carefully, her knitting resting on the table beside her. "It is not uncommon," she said softly, "for family to lose touch with the minutiae of a relative's home, but one would think a nephew would know whether a path led through the roses, or where the old sundial stood." His fingers twitched imperceptibly. "I must confess I only know of the cottage through letters, ma'am, and, well, some recollections from neighbors." "I had hoped that would suffice." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her eyes meeting his with gentle scrutiny. "Sometimes, Mr. Denham, knowing what not to notice can reveal far more than remembering everything. The details we overlook or invent have a way of betraying themselves." The young man swallowed, nodding, though the subtle tension in his shoulders betrayed the impact of her words. Miss Marple placed her teacup carefully on its saucer, observing the room with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to read more than words. Outside, the soft rustle of autumn leaves continued along the lane, and inside, the truth, subtle and careful, waited quietly for recognition. Chapter 6. Threads of the Past. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary Mead's small parish church, casting muted colors onto the worn wooden pews. Miss Marple had accompanied Mrs. Price Ridley on her usual errand of delivering donations to the charity box, a task she found both comforting and quietly revealing. Today, however, her keen eye caught something unusual among the neatly folded linens and tins of preserves. Nestled at the bottom of the box, partially hidden beneath a piece of embroidered cloth, was a strand of pearls. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, letting the soft weight rest in her hand. The pearls were unmistakable, fine, lustrous, arranged with a care that suggested both wealth and sentiment. She recognized them immediately as belonging to Mrs. Clara Denham, recalling the photograph she had seen weeks ago. The pearls draped elegantly around the woman's neck, catching sunlight in the garden at Morningside Cottage. Her mind worked quietly, cataloging possibilities. How had the necklace come to be placed in the charity box? Surely no one unaware of its value would have included it in a routine donation. The act suggested intention, a deliberate choice to remove the item from view while creating a veneer of innocence. Even charity, Miss Marple thought, can conceal a crime. She turned the pearls over in her hand, noting a tiny nick on one, perhaps the result of haste or nervous handling. Someone had wanted to dispose of this evidence without attracting attention, confident that the routine of daily donations would hide their actions from casual eyes. Yet Miss Marple's observation skills, honed over decades of quiet watching and listening, caught what others might overlook. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned closer, curiosity glinting in her eyes. "Why, Miss Marple, that necklace, why would anyone put it here?" Miss Marple's gaze returned to the pearls, thoughtful. "It is often the simplest acts that carry the heaviest meaning. This was not a gift nor a careless loss. Someone wanted it removed, but with discretion. The question is why and for whose benefit." She gently placed the necklace into her reticule, careful not to disturb its arrangement. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves along the churchyard path, and the soft chiming of the nearby clock marked the slow passage of the morning. The village moved as if nothing had occurred, yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, threads of intrigue began to intertwine. Miss Marple's mind traced connections. The hidden photograph, the stranger claiming to be a nephew, the unexplained lights at Morningside Cottage. Each clue, however small, formed part of an intricate pattern, and the necklace was now a luminous knot in the fabric of the mystery. Whoever had placed it in the charity box had underestimated the power of quiet observation, the patience of someone who noticed details others dismissed. She rose, smoothing her skirts, and stepped toward the door. The pearls rested securely in her bag, a reminder that even the most generous gesture could carry secret weight. And in the calm of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple understood that hidden truths often reveal themselves in the least likely of places, awaiting only a careful eye and a patient mind to bring them fully to light. Miss Marple's sitting room was warm with the late afternoon sun, casting a golden glow over the polished wood and neatly arranged books. The teapot steamed gently on the table, surrounded by delicate china cups and a plate of currant scones. She had invited Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Bantry over, sensing that casual conversation often revealed what careful questioning could not. "Tea, my dears?" she said, lifting the lid of the teapot. "It's been such a curious week in the village, hasn't it?" Mrs. Bantry accepted a cup, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Curious indeed, Miss Marple. Morningside Cottage has caused quite a stir. The lights, the footsteps, and now apparently a missing lady." Mrs. Price Ridley nodded vigorously. "And the pearls. Can you imagine? Found in the charity box, no less. One begins to wonder what else might surface if we pay attention." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, letting the aroma rise. "Sometimes, dears, small details lead us to larger truths. Take Mrs. Denham, for instance. We all recall her gentle manner, her polite retreat when startled, but do we know much of her past?" Mrs. Bantry tilted her head. "Past? Why, I thought she was quite ordinary, except for the occasional rumors." Miss Marple smiled faintly, letting the silence linger before continuing. "Rumors often have roots in truth. I recently discovered something quite unexpected. Did you know Mrs. Denham once had a twin sister?" The two women gasped softly, leaning closer. "A twin sister?" Mrs. Price Ridley repeated. "But I thought she was alone." "Dead, wasn't she?" Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "Presumed dead, yes. That much is true. But consider the implications. One twin disappears and the remaining sister carries not only her own history, but also shadows left behind by her sibling. Secrets long buried often shape the present in ways outsiders cannot imagine." Mrs. Bantry's brow furrowed. "I had no idea. No wonder the village found her. Intriguing. Perhaps some of the mystery around Morningside Cottage is connected to this hidden history." Miss Marple sipped her tea, enjoying the faint spice of bergamot as she reflected. Every shared secret has its echo. Gossip, when handled carefully, can reveal truths that polite observation alone might miss. And in a village such as ours, where everyone notices the smallest details, echoes of the past often resurface in the most unexpected ways. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward. "Do you think that the missing woman or the lights in the window could be connected to this twin?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted behind her spectacles. "It is a possibility, certainly. The past often leaves traces that time alone cannot erase. One must observe carefully, listen attentively, and remember that even a small detail, such as a misplaced letter, a glancing remark, or a forgotten photograph, can illuminate the story entirely." The three women continued their tea, letting conversation drift from pastries to village happenings. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple's mind catalogued every comment, every glance, every hesitation. Each word, each pause was a thread she could follow, unraveling the fabric of mystery that wove itself so quietly through Morningside Cottage and the lives it touched. As the afternoon waned, a shadow fell across the window panes, and Miss Marple quietly noted it, a reminder that even in the calmest of moments, the past lingered, waiting to reveal itself in subtle, undeniable ways. Chapter 7. The Reveal Beneath the Fog. The morning fog lay thick across St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of cottages and trees, muting the familiar streets into a dreamlike haze. Miss Marple walked along the lane with deliberate steps, her eyes catching every subtle movement, the rustle of a curtain, the faint impression of footprints on dew-dampened grass. She carried with her the weight of weeks of observation, quiet deductions and whispered confidences, each step bringing her closer to a truth that had waited patiently beneath layers of time and secrecy. At last, she reached Morningside Cottage. The green coat appeared in the mist, moving with a careful grace, each step measured yet unguarded. The woman's eyes met Miss Marple's with an intensity that spoke of both recognition and unspoken pain. And in that gaze Miss Marple understood immediately. This was no ordinary visitor. The air seemed to still around them as if the village itself held its breath. "Clara?" Miss Marple ventured softly, though the name felt inadequate. The woman inclined her head slightly, a shadow of a smile touching her lips. "Not Clara," she said, her voice low and certain, "but Eleanor. Her twin, thought lost, forgotten, erased from memory. Yet I have returned, to reclaim what was stolen. My life, my name, the truths hidden beneath years of deception." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, observed every detail, the tilt of her chin, the careful way she kept her hands visible, the subtle tension in her shoulders. "And the other Clara?" she asked gently, sensing the undercurrent of history woven between the two women. "She was always careful," Eleanor replied. "Clever, measured, hiding not only her fears but mine as well. We shared blood, yet our lives became threads in a tapestry of deceit. The village remembers only what it was told. It does not see what was taken, what was hidden, what was lost between us." Miss Marple's mind traced the connections, the flickering lights, the pressed violet, the pearls in the charity box, the broken teacup, the stranger claiming to be a nephew. Each small detail had been a whisper from the past, a signal pointing toward this revelation. Sometimes it takes a ghost, she thought, to tell the living what really happened. And in this fog-shrouded morning, Eleanor seemed both ghost and living witness, returning to settle accounts long overdue. The green coat seemed to shimmer slightly as Eleanor stepped closer, the mist curling around her like a veil. Her eyes, sharp and clear, held both sorrow and determination. "I did not wish to frighten anyone," she said, "but to restore what was lost, one must tread where silence has reigned too long." Miss Marple nodded, the calm authority of her years of observation guiding her response. The truth often hides in small details, in pauses, in what people choose not to say. It reveals itself when patience meets attention. The two women regarded one another for a long moment, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. Eleanor's return was not merely an appearance but a reclamation, a gentle yet inexorable restoration of memory, identity, and rights long obscured. Outside, the village continued under its foggy veil. Miss Marple stepped carefully over the threshold of Morningside Cottage, her eyes immediately taking in the familiar yet now strangely charged interior. The morning fog still clung to the garden outside, seeping in through the slightly ajar windows, softening the edges of furniture and floorboards. Eleanor, the twin long thought lost, stood near the hearth, her hands folded, her green coat discarded and draped over a chair. The tension in the room was palpable, yet Miss Marple moved with her usual calm authority, the quiet confidence that came from years of observation and understanding. "Eleanor," she began gently, "we have walked together through months of uncertainty, quiet clues, and small disturbances. But the heart of this story, the truth you have carried, is waiting to be spoken. I trust you will not withhold it any longer." The woman's eyes flickered, a mixture of fear, sorrow, and relief passing across her face. She swallowed, and then, as though the room itself were holding its breath, she began to speak. "It was never meant to harm anyone," she said, her voice low, almost trembling. "Years ago there was an incident, one that could have ended badly for both of us. I acted to protect myself, self-defense, nothing more. But the consequences, they were quiet, hidden, and for a long time I convinced myself that silence was the only safeguard." Miss Marple listened, her gaze steady, allowing the words to settle in the room. She noticed the slight quiver in Eleanor's hands, the careful way her shoulders moved as she exhaled, the weight she had carried in secrecy for so many years. Confession, when whispered, sounds almost like forgiveness, she thought, and the air seemed to soften around them. "I covered the truth," Eleanor continued, "because I feared reprisal, because I did not want to destroy lives. I left letters unsent, explanations unwritten, photographs tucked away. I thought that if I remained quiet, the past would stay buried. Yet in truth, it is always spoken through the smallest details. Broken teacups, misplaced pearls, faint lights in windows. Everything I tried to conceal left traces that only a careful observer could read. Miss Marple's fingers brushed lightly over a knitting needle resting on the table. "It is remarkable, Eleanor," she said softly, "how the smallest things can carry the heaviest meaning. Silence is powerful, yes, but truth, once recognized, has a way of setting both the speaker and the listener free." The woman lowered her head, a tear glistening at the corner of her eye. "I have carried it too long," she admitted. "I wanted to return, to reclaim what was mine, and perhaps to reconcile with the life I have taken care to conceal." Miss Marple inclined her head, acknowledging the courage required for such honesty. "Now that you have spoken, the village, the cottage, and indeed yourself may begin to breathe more freely. Shadows are dispelled not through punishment alone, but through understanding and the quiet acknowledgement of truth." Eleanor exhaled, a faint smile breaking through her weariness. The cottage seemed lighter, the sun filtering in through the curtains, illuminating the room with a soft warmth. The air, once heavy with unspoken guilt, now carried the delicate relief of confession. In the calm aftermath, Miss Marple observed the small details once more: the neat arrangement of the hearth, the lingering scent of tea, the subtle glint of pearls now safely returned. Each element spoke of lives intertwined, mistakes confronted, and burdens finally released. And as the afternoon light spread across Morningside Cottage, it became clear that sometimes honesty whispered gently can mend even the most tangled of pasts. Chapter 8. Peace Restored. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a crisp, clear light that chased away the lingering fog from the previous days. The cottages, gardens, and narrow lanes shimmered under the gentle sun, each surface gleaming with dew. Miss Marple stepped onto her veranda, inhaling the cool air, and felt the village settle back into its familiar rhythm. The tension that had clung to streets and hedges seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only the ordinary, comforting sounds of life: birdsong, a distant church bell, and the faint rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. At Morningside Cottage, Inspector Cray closed his notebook with a quiet sense of finality. He had spent long hours reviewing observations, interviewing neighbors, and tracing subtle threads, but now there was no urgency left in the investigation. The mystery had revealed itself in gentle human ways rather than through dramatic confrontation. He gave a nod to the cottage door as Mrs. Clara Denham, accompanied by her twin sister Eleanor, slipped quietly out. Their footsteps were measured, unhurried, and the air around them carried the ease of lives reconciled. Miss Marple watched them go, noting the faint relief in their shoulders and the tentative smiles exchanged. There was no need for announcements, no triumphs declared, just the quiet reclaiming of lives disrupted by misunderstanding and secrecy. The village, too, would eventually take note, whispering among its residents, yet the revelations were now grounded in forgiveness and comprehension, rather than fear. Returning to her own garden, Miss Marple knelt among her roses, her fingers brushing over soft petals and thorned stems alike. The flowers had grown resilient over the autumn chill, blossoming despite occasional storms and frost. It reminded her, as she had known for years, that truth blooms in its own time, sometimes hidden beneath layers of uncertainty until the moment arrives for it to be recognized. She paused to inhale the scent of her favorite blooms, considering the interplay of secrecy, courage, and patience that had led to the resolution. The footprints, the lights in the window, the broken teacup, the pearls, all had been signals that required attentive eyes and a calm mind. Each small clue, once carefully observed, had contributed to the village's restored harmony. When the mist clears, she thought, even secrets look smaller. The phrase settled comfortably in her mind, reflecting the gentle wisdom earned through years of quiet observation. There was a rhythm to the world that persisted regardless of the mysteries that occasionally disturbed it. Life in St. Mary Mead, calm and habitual, had returned to its usual cadence. Miss Marple lingered among the flowers for a few more moments, her thoughts drifting to the people whose lives had intersected with the cottage's story. Understanding, patience, and attention had guided them through uncertainty, and now the village could breathe with the satisfaction that comes when curiosity is satisfied, and wrongs are gently acknowledged. The warmth of the sun on her shoulders felt like a quiet promise that, no matter the shadows that occasionally passed through, the day would always arrive with light. The roses swayed softly in the breeze, a delicate nod to resilience and clarity, while the village beyond hummed quietly, secure in the knowledge that the past had been faced, the present understood, and peace had quietly returned to Morningside Cottage and its neighbors alike. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over St. Mary Mead, illuminating the familiar contours of the village that had, over recent days, been cloaked in uncertainty and quiet speculation. Miss Marple found herself once again at the vicarage, the comforting aroma of tea leaves mingling with the faint scent of baking from a nearby kitchen. Mrs. Price Ridley bustled about, setting out delicate china cups and a small plate of scones, while the vicar pored over parish letters with a calm attentiveness that suggested both curiosity and relief. Miss Marple settled into a chair by the window, watching the gentle sway of the trees outside. "It's remarkable," she began, speaking softly so that only the vicar could hear, "how the village resumes its rhythm, as if nothing had disturbed it at all. And yet, beneath the quiet there is always a story, sometimes sorrow, sometimes mystery, but always something that reminds us how human we are." The vicar nodded, setting down his pen. "Indeed, Miss Marple. And in Morningside Cottage it seems the past has been reconciled, if quietly. No scandal, no harm left unresolved, only understanding." Miss Marple smiled faintly, lifting her teacup to savor the warmth. "You see, it is not evil that hides in cottages," she mused, "but sorrow, fear, and the consequences of human hesitation. Secrets linger not out of malice but out of the need to protect oneself, to shield others, or simply to wait for courage to arrive." She tapped her fingers lightly against the delicate porcelain, thinking of Eleanor and Clara Denham, their lives intertwined by circumstance and past mistakes, and now gently disentangled. The kettle whistled softly, a bright note in the quiet room. Mrs. Price Ridley poured the steaming tea, and the three of them settled into the familiar rhythm of conversation, punctuated by sips and thoughtful pauses. Outside, the village hummed with the ordinary activities of daily life. The sound of footsteps along the lane, a dog barking in the distance, children's laughter drifting faintly from the schoolyard. It was ordinary yet extraordinary in its reminder that life persisted, carrying both memory and renewal. "Perhaps every village has its mystery," Miss Marple continued, her eyes glinting gently, "just enough to keep us human. A challenge for observation, patience, and compassion, quietly reminding us that we are all connected by the smallest details and the softest whispers." The vicar smiled, understanding the weight and gentleness of her words. Tea, scones, and conversation filled the room with a comforting cadence, yet the discussion of past events allowed reflection to deepen. Every unspoken thought, every carefully remembered gesture from recent days, seemed to settle into a harmonious whole. Miss Marple set her teacup down, letting her fingers rest lightly upon the saucer. Outside, sunlight glinted off the rooftops and cobblestones, highlighting the serenity of a village that had endured uncertainty, yet emerged with clarity and calm. She thought of the lessons carried in small observations, of how sorrow and misunderstanding could quietly shape lives, and how, in the patient hands of those willing to see, those shadows could finally be understood, and even softened. The afternoon passed gently, the whistle of the kettle a soft reminder that ordinary moments, tea, conversation, reflection, could carry a profound sense of resolution, and in the calm Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, knowing that St. Mary Mead had returned to its quiet human rhythm, mysteries acknowledged and peace restored. The fire in St. Mary Mead's sitting room had burned low, leaving glowing embers that cast a soft warmth across the familiar furniture. Teacups sat empty on the table, their faint scent of tea lingering in the air, and the gentle hush of evening settled over the village. Another story had unfolded, revealing hidden truths, quiet courage, and the delicate threads of human nature that wove through Morningside Cottage and beyond. Thank you for joining me tonight, for stepping into the calm lanes, listening to the rustle of leaves, the faint flicker of light through foggy windows, and the subtle whispers of a village where every life carries its own little mysteries. Perhaps as you reflect, you'll notice how small secrets shape our days, how unspoken acts of kindness and courage leave lasting traces, and how sometimes the gentlest response is simply understanding. And so, as the fog rose, so did understanding, gentle, and just in time for tea. The Denham sisters have returned to their paths. The village has resumed its quiet rhythm, and for tonight, peace has settled softly over St. Mary Mead. If you enjoyed tonight's mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more evenings in St. Mary Mead. Sleep well, keep your curiosity alive, and remember, every village has its stories, just waiting for someone patient enough to notice.